when my daughter told me, "Go find somewhere else to die. You're useless now." I packed my bags like a mother who had spent her whole life obeying her child. 3 days later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office discovering that the husband I thought I had understood for 43 years had been playing the longest chess game in history. Corinne was about to learn a very painful lesson. Sometimes the pawn is the one who becomes the queen. If you're watching this story, subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just my story. It's the story of how a woman who was treated as useless took her entire life back. 2 months ago, I was still Althea Sterling, a devoted wife for 43 years and the mother of a daughter so ungrateful it was almost unbelievable. When Milton died of a heart attack at the age of 71, I truly believed my world had ended. I remember that night clearly. A September night in Newark, cold air from Branch Brook Park blowing through the hospital window. Milton lay in the bed and I was holding his hand tightly. 43 years of marriage, ending in a white hospital room with the steady beep of the heart monitor sounding like a clock counting down. "Althea," Milton whispered, his voice so weak it nearly dissolved into the air. "You'll be okay. I've taken care of everything." At the time, I thought he meant the will, the life insurance, the things older couples worry about when one of them is about to leave. I had no idea. He was talking about something much deeper, much more complicated, and far more painful. Corinne showed up at the funeral like a vulture in a designer dress. She hugged me in front of everyone, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Mom, this must be so hard for you." Then, just minutes later, when no one was watching, she began calculating. "You can't possibly manage such a big house by yourself," Corinne said. "The stairs, the maintenance, all those memories. It's not good for your health." I should have seen the scheming behind those caring words. Corinne had always been Milton's favorite, his little princess, the child who, in his eyes, could never do wrong. When Corinne married Bryce Hollowell, an investment banker, and started having children, Milton spoiled that little family like it was treasure. And me, I was just the woman behind the scenes, the one who cooked, cleaned, and kept everything running. After the funeral, Corinne talked more and more about my condition. She kept bringing Bryce over for dinner, and every time they came, they boxed me in with real estate brochures and thin little books about retirement communities. "Mom, these places are wonderful," Corinne said, her voice sweet as honey. "You'll meet people your age, have activities, no responsibilities at all." What they really meant was no estate to divide and no inconvenient mother to deal with. You need to understand our house. We lived in Forest Hill, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Newark. Tree-lined streets, Tudor and Victorian homes standing quietly like old castles. Our house was a 3-story Victorian built in 1920. It had stained glass windows, a marble fireplace, and a backyard garden where I had grown roses for 20 years. Every corner of that house held a piece of my life. The kitchen where I taught Corinne to bake chocolate cake when she was 5. The living room where Milton and I danced every New Year's Eve. And the small room on the 3rd floor, where I once dreamed the dreams a black woman born in the 1950s was never supposed to say out loud. Going to college, having a career, being valued for who she was, not for how well she cooked or cleaned. The real blow came last Tuesday. I had been living in the house Corinne now called our home for 6 weeks since Milton died. I was still sleeping in the living room because I couldn't bring myself to pack up our master bedroom. Corinne showed up without warning, with Bryce and 2 large suitcases. "Mom, we've decided," Corinne said in the tone of someone firing an employee. "Bryce got a promotion. We need to move closer to downtown. This house is perfect for our family." I stared at her, not understanding. "Move in? But this is my house." Corinne's mask dropped. "Actually, according to Dad's will, I inherited everything. The house. The investments. All of it." I let you stay here out of kindness, but now it's time for you to find somewhere else. It felt like someone had punched me in the chest. Corinne, there must be some mistake. There isn't. Dad knew I would take better care of the assets than you. You never understood money or investing. You were just a wife. Just a wife. 43 years. Reduced to 3 words. Then she said the final thing. Go find somewhere else to die. You're useless now. I packed my life into 2 suitcases. 1 box of photographs. Corinne stood by the door watching her watch as if I were delaying her schedule. There's a good senior complex on Sanford Avenue, she said. Very affordable. Affordable, while she was about to inherit $33 million. Bryce loaded my luggage into their BMW like he was throwing out trash. Althea, you'll like having your independence again, he said, not meeting my eyes. No more property taxes or maintenance to worry about. No more home. That's what he meant. As the car pulled away from Forest Hill, I watched my house disappear in the rearview mirror. They dropped me at the Sunset Inn in Irvington on Springfield Avenue. Not Forest Hill, $49 a night. Thin walls, thinner towels, worn-out carpet. Corinne handed me $200 like she was tipping a maid. That should last you a few days, she said. I sat on the sagging mattress and stared at my 2 suitcases, 6 outfits, 1 pair of shoes. The jewelry box Milton gave me, our wedding album, and a diary from when I was 25. In it, I had written, "One day I will open a bakery for Black people like us." I never did, because Milton needed me. Because Corinne needed me. Because a good wife wasn't allowed to have dreams. Milton was always meticulous with paperwork. He had shown me the will, and I was certain Corinne was lying. I remembered a night 6 months before he died. Althea, I worry about how Corinne treats you. I didn't understand then. Now, I did. The next morning, I went to find Victor Langley, Milton's lawyer. I took the bus down Broad Street, past Military Park, past my memories, and I knew if I didn't take that bus, I would die exactly the way my daughter had told me to. If you want to know what was waiting for me in Victor Langley's office, and why 3 days later, Corinne would begin to lose everything, watch the next part, because there, the truth will begin to bleed. Victor Langley was a distinguished man in his 70s, moving slowly but with certainty, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office in downtown Newark smelled of polished wood, aged paper, and that deep, solemn calm that belongs to places where people come to have their destinies changed. When the secretary stepped out and quietly said, "Mrs. Sterling is here about her husband's estate," Victor Langley looked up, and the surprise on his face was not polite. It was real. "Althea, my dear," he stood up, his voice warm but threaded with a thin line of concern. "I was wondering when you would come. I tried calling you at home several times, but Corinne said you were traveling." "Traveling?" I stood frozen for a second, a cold feeling running down my spine. Before I even sat down, the image replayed in my mind. Corinne standing in the doorway of the Forest Hill house, arms crossed, eyes on her watch, telling me to go find somewhere else to die. And at the very same time, she had calmly told the lawyer that I was traveling. I swallowed hard. "Mr. Langley," I began, my voice trembling despite my effort to control it, "I need to ask you about Milton's will." Victor Langley frowned, as though he had just heard something unreasonable. "Of course. Didn't Corinne give you your copy?" he asked. I gave her the original and several copies after the will reading. I felt my heart drop. "The will reading?" I repeated, like someone hearing a word for the first time and not believing it exists. Victor Langley looked at me for a long moment. Then he exhaled, and his kind eyes turned serious. "Althea, you were supposed to be there. Corinne told me you were too devastated, that she would handle everything and make sure you received your share." The blood drained from my face. So there really had been a will reading, and I had been deliberately excluded. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the more I spoke, the drier my throat became. Mr. Langley, I was never informed of any will reading. Corinne told me she inherited everything. Victor Langley's expression shifted instantly from confusion to alarm. He turned, grabbed a thick file from the cabinet, his movements suddenly urgent, as if a single second of delay might make things worse. Althea, that's impossible, he said in a lower voice. Your husband's will is very clear about what belongs to you. He placed the file on the desk and opened it. I saw Milton's neat signature at the bottom, the same signature I had seen for 43 years on everything from utility bills to the house deed. There were certifications, notarizations, and the moment Victor Langley began to read, I knew Corinne had lied about everything. I, Milton James Sterling, being of sound mind and body, hereby bequeath to my beloved wife, Althea Ann Sterling, the following: our primary residence at 847 Mount Prospect Avenue, Forest Hill, Newark, New Jersey, including all furnishings and personal property. In addition, I leave her 70% of all financial assets, investments, and accounts, totaling approximately $23 million. My head began to spin. $23 million. The house. 70% of everything. I couldn't breathe for several seconds. Not because of the money, but because of the cold, brutal truth. I had been stripped of the truth deliberately and cruelly. Victor Langley looked up at me, as if making sure I was still there, still listening. Then he continued, his voice even more serious. To my daughter, Corinne Sterling Hollowell, I leave $10 million held in trust, with distributions beginning on her 45th birthday, contingent upon how she treats her mother after my death, contingent upon how she treats me. I heard those words and something struck me in the chest. Milton knew, not suspected, not guessed. He knew. I looked at Victor Langley, my lips trembling. Mr. Langley, Corinne told me I inherited nothing. She moved into my house. She gave me $200 and suggested I look for a senior facility. The old lawyer's face flushed with anger. I had never seen someone with his level of composure look so furious. Althea, what Corinne has done constitutes elder abuse and fraud. She has committed multiple felonies. I clasped my hands together tightly. But she had paperwork. She showed me documents, I said, my voice shaking with fear and anger. Victor Langley shook his head firmly. Forgeries, most likely, or documents from an old draft. Your husband updated his will 6 months before he died, precisely because he was concerned about Corinne's attitude toward money and her sense of entitlement. The room seemed to tilt. I remembered every family dinner. Corinne talking over me, Corinne rolling her eyes when I offered an opinion, Corinne talking about expensive vacations, about optimizing assets, about cash flow, as if I were a maid standing beside the table, not her mother. And Milton had seen it. He had watched, he had assessed, and he had decided. There's more, Althea, Victor Langley said quietly. He turned to the next page. I saw handwritten notes in the margins, Milton's handwriting, the final thoughts of a man who knew he was running out of time. The trust clause for Corinne states that if she does not treat you with respect and dignity, after my death, the entire $10 million will transfer to you. I stared, unable to believe what I was hearing. You're saying that... I couldn't finish the sentence. Victor Langley nodded. I'm saying your daughter has just cost herself $10 million. That portion now belongs to you. You are not inheriting $23 million. You are inheriting $33 million, plus the house and all personal property. The irony was so perfect it was almost cruel. Corinne had been so eager to steal her share that she had triggered the very clause designed to punish her greed. But then another thought fell on me, heavy as stone. Victor, I said, using his first name for the first time because I needed something human to hold on to. How did Milton know? How did he know Corinne would do this? Victor Langley leaned back, looking out the window toward Broad Street. Cars moved below. People walked, bought coffee, lived their lives as if moments like this didn't exist. "Your husband came to see me last March," he said slowly. He said something had changed in Corinne. She had started asking about his assets, about the estate, about what would happen when he died. Not the normal concern of a child, but the calculating kind. "Last March." I remembered. Corinne and Bryce had visited. I had heard them arguing in the car before they came inside. Bryce had said something about needing liquidity and investment opportunities. Corinne had replied with something I had told myself I must have misheard. "Don't worry, when Dad dies, we'll have more than enough." Now I knew I hadn't misheard. Victor Langley continued, "Milton came into this office and asked to change his will. He wanted to make sure you were protected, not just financially, but in dignity." "Dignity," I repeated, and tears began to fall. "He said you had given up too much, that you deserved respect, recognition, and security. And if Corinne couldn't provide that, then at least she would not profit from the lack of it." I couldn't hold it in anymore. I had held myself together for 6 weeks. I didn't cry at the funeral. I didn't cry when I was thrown out of my house. I didn't cry at the Sunset Inn. But now, in the clean office of a lawyer, I cried like a child, loud, ugly, aching sobs, as if some part of me was finally allowed to admit how badly I had been treated. If you're listening to this and thinking, "So that's it, Althea wins?" No, not yet, because the truth is, the will was only the first blow. The second blow was what changed me from the woman who had packed 2 suitcases in silence, and that second blow was inside a small wooden box. Victor Langley stood up, went to a filing cabinet, and removed a wooden box. He held it with both hands, as if it were not an object, but a final testament. "Milton left this for you," he said softly. "He instructed me to give it to you only when Corinne proved him right." I opened the box with shaking hands. Inside was a USB drive and an envelope. On the envelope was Milton's handwriting. "For Althea, the woman I should have loved better." I held the envelope, my throat tightening instantly. 43 years of marriage, and Milton's first apology came as ink on paper. "There's a video on that," Victor Langley explained. "Milton recorded it 3 weeks before he died. He wanted you to understand his decision, and he wanted you to know he always knew you were the strongest person in the family." I closed my hand around the USB drive. So small, yet as heavy as my entire life. "What do I do now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Victor Langley smiled, and for the first time since Milton died, I felt real warmth directed toward me. "Now, my dear, we call the police about fraud. And then we call Corinne and inform her that she is about to receive the shock of her life." "Can she fight it?" I asked. Victor Langley shook his head. "With what money? She's about to discover that every account she thinks she controls actually belongs to you. Every investment, every bank account, all will be frozen pending a fraud investigation." I imagined Corinne in my house. Maybe she was measuring the kitchen for renovations, maybe browsing for new sofas, maybe boasting to Bryce that everything is finally theirs. And Bryce, probably calculating how their portfolio would grow once the inheritance was transferred. They had no idea that in about 6 hours, their entire world would collapse. Victor Langley gave me a private conference room to watch the video. The room had glass windows overlooking Military Park. Outside, people walked in the autumn sunlight. Life went on, calm and ordinary, while my world was turning on a completely different axis. I plugged the USB into the laptop. My hands were still shaking. The screen lit up, and then Milton appeared. He was sitting in our home office, the office that was now mine. He looked tired, older than I remembered. The video was recorded in August, only 3 weeks before he died. I could see illness in his eyes, a kind of exhaustion that had soaked into his bones. "Althea," he began. Just 2 syllables were enough to make my heart ache. That voice, I would never hear it again. "If you're watching this, it means what I feared has happened. Corinne has done exactly what I warned about, and you, the love of my life, have suffered because of it." Milton paused and took a sip of water from a glass on the desk. I recognized the blue glass, the one I had bought at a flea market in Red Bank 20 years ago. One small detail was enough to break me. Even while keeping so many things from me, he had kept what I chose for him. "I know you will wonder why I didn't tell you sooner," Milton continued, "but how could I tell you that I believed our daughter, the child you raised with all your love, was capable of betraying you so cruelly?" He looked straight into the camera, and I felt as if he were looking straight at me. "I watched Corinne for years, Althea. I saw how she treated you, the small dismissals, the way she minimized your contributions, the way she put money and status above family and character. And I realized I was also to blame." His voice trembled. "I spoiled Corinne. I taught her that money buys happiness, that success is measured by bank balances, that people without money are worth less, and in doing that, I taught her to disrespect the most important thing in my life, you." Tears streamed freely down my face. "You gave up everything for this family, Althea. You gave up your dream of opening a bakery. You think I didn't know? But I found your journal years ago. You gave up college when we discovered Corinne was on the way. You put your dreams aside to support mine, to raise our child, to make this house into a place people walked into and felt like heaven." Milton wiped his eyes. And I realized this was the first time I had ever seen Milton cry. "And how did I repay you?" he said hoarsely. "By making you feel small, by over-explaining money as if you were a child, by letting Corinne learn from my example that it was acceptable to belittle you." He leaned back, exhausted. "So I created this will, not just to protect you financially, but to send a message. To Corinne, actions have consequences. To you, you have always had value. You have always mattered. And if I failed to show you that while I was alive, at least I could try to show you in my death." Milton looked into the camera one last time. "Do not forgive Corinne too easily. Do not let your kindness get you hurt again. She needs to learn accountability, and you need to learn to trust in your own worth." Then he spoke his final words slowly and clearly, like a vow. "I love you, Althea Sterling. I have always loved you, even when I failed to show it the right way. Accept this inheritance not only as a gift, but as an apology, and live the life you deserve." The screen went black. I sat motionless in the conference room, afternoon sunlight falling through the window. I cried for a husband I thought I knew, but never fully understood. I cried for a marriage that could have been better. I cried for the woman I used to be, the woman who lived 43 years feeling she was not enough. But I also cried for another reason, because for the first time in my life, someone had told me I mattered, that I had value, that my sacrifices had been seen and named for what they were. Milton was not perfect. He made mistakes, but in the end, he tried to correct them in the only way he knew how. There was a gentle knock on the door. Victor Langley looked in, his eyes asking, "Are you all right?" I wiped my tears. I stood up, and I felt something change inside me. Not anger, not yet, but determination. "Victor," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. "Call the police." "It's time my daughter learned the lesson I should have taught her long ago." Victor Langley smiled. "What lesson, Althea?" I looked straight at him, and for the first time I heard myself say it, clear as a declaration, that no one, not even my child, has the right to take away my worth. And anyone who tries will pay the price. Victor Langley nodded. In his eyes, I was no longer a widow pushed out of her home. He saw a woman standing up. And that woman was going to fight. Victor Langley's office, within just a few hours, had turned into a real command center. He laughed as he called it Operation Justice, as if he were running a military campaign rather than an inheritance dispute. His desk phone wouldn't stop ringing. He spoke with the police, the banks, and then a private investigator. Meanwhile, I sat in the leather chair across from his desk, my mind still spinning, trying to grasp the full scale of what Corinne had done. I hadn't just been thrown out of my home. I had been erased from the truth, turned into a woman who was traveling in the story my daughter invented so she could steal my entire life. Detective Naomi Pierce arrived shortly after. She was a tall, slim black woman with a straight posture and eyes so sharp they made you feel that if you lied, she would hear it before you even opened your mouth. Naomi Pierce sat down, opened the stack of papers Corinne had once shoved in front of me, and began going through each page with the focus of a hunter tracking a trail. She flipped through the fake will, paused at the signature, paused at the seal, paused at certain lines of wording as if she were studying the traces of a crime hidden beneath perfume. "These forged documents are fairly sophisticated," Detective Pierce said, calm but firm. "This isn't impulsive crime. Someone planned this very carefully." I clenched my hands together. "Do you think Corinne had help?" I asked. Detective Pierce looked up and met my eyes. "Almost certainly. Creating fake legal documents that look credible like this requires specific knowledge and connections. We need to investigate whether Bryce, or someone in his financial network, was involved." Hearing Bryce's name sent something cold through me. I had always felt my son-in-law was too polite, too controlled. The kind of man who could say, "Don't worry, Mom," in a gentle voice while his hand was locking the door behind your back. Within 2 hours, everything began collapsing like dominoes. Accounts were frozen one by one. Every credit card Corinne had linked to what she believed was her inheritance account started getting declined. Utilities in the house, things Corinne had rushed to put in her own name, were suspended pending verification of ownership. My Forest Hill house, the place Corinne thought she had seized, suddenly became a fortress with no power, no access, and no sense of certainty left to lean on. And I knew the call would come. There's a strange moment right before you pick up the phone from someone who has harmed you. You're no longer afraid of them. You're just curious. Curious what they'll say when they lose all power to save themselves. Curious how their voice will shake when they finally understand. You are no longer the woman who breaks easily. I looked at the clock, and just as instinct told me it would, at 3:47 p.m., the phone rang. Corinne's name appeared on the screen. I looked at Victor Langley. I looked at Detective Pierce. Detective Pierce nodded calmly and turned on the recorder. I picked up. "Mom, where are you?" Corinne's voice was tight as a wire. She tried to sound composed, but at the edge of it was a thin layer of panic. "There's some kind of confusion with the bank accounts. They said Dad's assets are frozen." I surprised myself with how calm I was. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, my voice even and gentle. So gentle I could hardly believe it. "I'm sitting in Victor Langley's office." "Do you remember him?" "Dad's lawyer, the man who read the real will to an empty room while you told him I was traveling." Silence. A silence long enough for me to hear Corinne's breathing compress like she was trying to swallow a stone. Then she snapped out of it. "Mom, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I discovered that you are a liar and a thief, my dear daughter," I said. I didn't raise my voice, but every word dropped like a hammer. "And I also discovered that your father was far smarter than either of us ever realized." "I don't understand," Corinne said quickly, dumping a flood of words on me. "I was protecting you from how complicated it is to manage that money. You've never had to deal with investments, or I understand very well." I cut in. I felt something cold and furious rise in me, but it didn't make me shake anymore. It made me clear. You forged legal documents, committed fraud, and threw your 67-year-old mother out of her own house because you thought I was too stupid to notice. Corinne's voice changed instantly, sharper, more desperate. "Mom, you're confused. Grief is too much for you, and clearly someone is taking advantage of your emotional state." I almost laughed at the audacity. Even caught red-handed, Corinne was still trying to turn me into the unstable one, so she could be the reasonable one. "Corinne, my dear, let me make something very clear," I said, gentle but hard as steel. "Not only are you not inheriting anything the way you thought, but your real inheritance, $10 million your father left you, now belongs to me." I paused for exactly one beat, long enough for it to sink in. Because of a very lovely clause your father included, the clause requiring you to treat me with respect and dignity. "That's impossible." "Detective Naomi Pierce is sitting right here," I said, "if you'd like to discuss what's impossible about fraud charges with her." The line went quiet. I could almost picture Corinne standing somewhere in my house, eyes darting, mind racing like a computer, searching for an exit. Finally, her voice softened, the negotiation voice. "Mom, please, can we meet somewhere and talk reasonably? I'm sure we can work something out." I leaned back in the chair, staring up at the office ceiling like I was looking at an old story. "Oh, we will definitely meet," I said, "in court." "When you're prosecuted." Corinne's voice jumped as if pricked with a needle. "You wouldn't dare charge your own daughter." And in that exact moment, something crystallized inside my chest. Cold, final. I thought of the journal with dead dreams. I thought of 43 years of making myself small. I thought of that night in the Irvington motel, listening to people argue through thin walls while my daughter slept in my bed. "Watch me," I said, and I hung up. I looked at Victor Langley. He was glowing, as if he had just watched a woman walk through the last door. "How long before she's arrested?" I asked. Victor looked at Detective Pierce. "I have enough evidence to request an arrest warrant," Detective Pierce answered, her tone clipped and cold. "They'll pick her up tonight." "And Bryce?" Detective Pierce narrowed her eyes, a smile flashing like a blade. "His financial records have been subpoenaed. If he participated in creating those documents, he will face charges too." My phone vibrated. A message from Corinne. "Mom, please don't do this. Think about the grandchildren." I showed the screen to Detective Pierce. She smirked, like someone who had seen this trick 1,000 times. "Emotional manipulation. Classic behavioral pattern for this type of criminal." I typed back without hesitation. "I am thinking about them. They deserve to see what happens when you steal from family." 20 minutes later, Bryce called. "Althea, surely we can handle this privately. Corinne made some bad decisions, but involving the police seems excessive." I cut him off immediately. "Bryce, did you help her forge those documents?" That's not... Althea, you have to understand the pressure Corinne is under. She's worried about your mental state, your ability to handle that kind of money." I heard myself conclude, calmly, "Then that's a yes." Bryce switched into explanation mode, the voice of a man used to managing crises with words. "It wasn't malicious. She truly believed she was protecting you by throwing me out of my own house and telling me to go find somewhere else to die?" I asked. Bryce went silent. That silence said everything. "Bryce, this is what's going to happen," I said, each word clear. "Both of you will be arrested. Both of you will face federal fraud charges, and I will sit in my house, and watch it happen." "Althea, please be reasonable," I answered slowly, like closing a coffin lid. "I've been reasonable for 43 years. It didn't do me any good." The police arrested Corinne at 8:30 p.m. while she was eating dinner at Forno's of Spain in the Ironbound. Clearly, she was celebrating her inheritance with Bryce and another couple. According to Detective Pierce, Corinne screamed that it was a wrongful arrest and demanded a lawyer. And the small tragedy of stupidity was this. The lawyer she called was Bryce's golf buddy, and that man had no criminal law experience. Bryce was arrested at his office the next morning. Forensic accountants traced the forged paper trail back to a printing company, a company Bryce's side used to produce shady investment prospectuses. And it turned out my son-in-law had a fairly significant history of financial crimes, something Corinne either didn't know or deliberately ignored. That night, I went home. The first night I slept in Forest Hill, and the first time in 43 years I slept in the master bedroom like the true owner. Corinne had stuffed her belongings into every empty space: designer clothes, expensive cosmetics, the chaos of someone who thought she had won. I didn't scream. I didn't smash anything. I simply packed it all into trash bags and set them on the front porch so she could collect them when she made bail. The house felt completely different now. Not just because Milton was gone, but because I was finally seeing it through my own eyes. For decades, I had maintained this place like Milton's sanctuary, every corner designed around his preferences, his needs, his vision of how we should live. But standing in those rooms, I suddenly realized a truth that made my throat tighten. In this house, there were too few traces of me, and that was about to change. I stood at the bedroom window looking out at the backyard garden. The roses I had planted were beginning to wilt in the autumn wind. Beyond the fence, the lights in other Forest Hill houses still glowed, families eating dinner, watching television, living ordinary lives. And my life was no longer ordinary. In just 2 days, I had gone from a woman with 2 suitcases and $200 to a millionaire with the entire justice system standing behind me. My phone rang. Victor Langley. Althea, I think you should know, Corinne's bail has been set at $50,000. With all accounts frozen, she'll have to find someone else to pay it. And Bryce? I asked. $200,000. Clearly the judge is not impressed with his financial crime history. I stood still, and the feeling inside me split into 2 halves. One half was the old mother, wanting to call Corinne, ask if she was okay, ask about the grandchildren. But the other half was the woman who had stepped out of the ashes, who understood that was exactly what Corinne was waiting for. She was waiting for me to save her. Like I always had. Like every good mother would. But sometimes, being a good mother means letting your child face the consequences of their own actions. Victor, I said, my voice steady, Corinne will have to handle it herself. It's time she learned how to live without my safety net. There was a pause on the other end. Then Victor exhaled, as if he had just heard what he was hoping to hear. You're doing the right thing, Althea. I know it doesn't feel like it, but you're doing the right thing. After I hung up, I went downstairs to Milton's study, my study now, and sat in his leather chair. The room still smelled like Cuban cigars, old leather-bound books, and something hard to name, something I could only call the scent of Milton. On the desk was the USB Victor had given me. I picked it up, felt its weight, a small object holding my husband's final words, his final secret, his final apology. I looked around the room, then whispered into the emptiness, You were right. You were right about her, and you were right about me. I was worth more. Outside the window, Newark glittered in the dark. The lights of downtown, the distant glow of Park Avenue, a vast world I had missed while I locked myself into the role of wife, mother, invisible woman. But I wasn't invisible anymore. And Corinne, and everyone who had ever dismissed me, minimized me, believed I was too weak to fight, was about to learn something. The woman you don't see is sometimes the most dangerous one of all. 3 days after Corinne's confession on my porch, my doorbell rang on a cold afternoon, one of those cold days that makes you feel like even the doorknob is on guard. When I opened the door, Bryce's mother was standing there. Lenora Hollowell, exactly what I had always pictured a woman would look like when she lived off the power of 3 generations of inherited wealth. Perfectly smoothed hair, jewelry worn in just the right amount, so people understood she didn't need to raise her voice, and a commanding aura that radiated as naturally as expensive perfume. I invited her in, not out of politeness, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see what version of the truth the Hollowells had constructed to explain why their son was facing felony charges. Lenora sat down in my living room as if she were granting me an audience. Back straight, chin slightly lifted, eyes sweeping the space as if checking whether anything in this house was worthy of her presence. "Althea, we need to discuss this situation in a reasonable way," she began, her voice low and smooth, as though she'd just finished reading a corporate memo. "Reasonable?" I went into the kitchen and poured tea, Earl Grey from the Chinese tea set Milton's mother once gave me, the one I had kept tucked away for years because I always felt I wasn't good enough to use it. Now, it was just tea. I set the cup down on the table and looked at her directly. "Your son helped steal my inheritance and threw me out of my own home." Lenora didn't blink. "Bryce only followed Corinne's lead. He didn't fully understand the situation." I nearly laughed. This woman was truly trying to pin it all on my daughter to save her son. The boldness of it, I had to admit, it was impressive. "Mrs. Hollowell, Bryce created forged legal documents," I said slowly, clearly. "That isn't following someone's lead. That's conspiracy to commit fraud." Lenora smiled, as if she had just found a loophole I couldn't see. "Bryce's attorney believes we can reach an agreement that benefits everyone," she said lightly. "You get your house back, Corinne faces appropriate consequences, and Bryce avoids the publicity of a trial." Appropriate consequences. She said it as if Corinne's crime were nothing more than a careless remark at a tea party. I leaned back, keeping my voice calm. "What kind of agreement?" Lenora's smile brightened, more confident now. "Bryce's family is prepared to compensate you for the inconvenience. Let's say $2 million in exchange for you dropping the charges against Bryce. $2 million. To forgive the man who helped steal $33 million from me." I set my teacup down so slowly I could hear the porcelain touch the wood. "Mrs. Hollowell, your son participated in a scheme that would have taken everything I own," I said, looking straight into her eyes. "Do you think $2 million covers that?" Lenora exhaled as if I were being deliberately dense. "Althea, be realistic. Bryce has a career, children, a reputation to maintain. Sending him to prison serves no one." "It serves justice," I answered. The polished mask on Lenora's face cracked just slightly. Not much, just enough for me to glimpse what was underneath. "Justice?" she scoffed. "You're destroying multiple families over money you will never even know how to manage." There it was. The same condescension that had poisoned Corinne. In their world, I was simply the woman behind the kitchen door who had accidentally climbed higher than her place. I stood up. I had no desire to drag this out, and "Mrs. Hollowell, I think we're done here." Lenora stood as well, but she didn't rush. She looked at me like I was a stubborn person who needed to be bent. "Althea, please reconsider. $5 million. Final offer." $5 million. A number large enough to make many people change their minds. But for me, there were things you couldn't put a price on. My answer is no. Lenora adjusted her handbag, composure restored as perfectly as if it had never been touched. Before she stepped out the door, she paused for exactly one beat, the kind of pause that tells you the next words aren't a goodbye, but a strike. "Fine, but you should know. Bryce's legal team has found some interesting information about your husband's business activities," she said, her voice light as wind. "It would be unfortunate if that became public during the trial. The threat was so clear it didn't need explaining. But strangely, I wasn't afraid. I was only curious." "What kind of information?" I asked. Lenora's mouth tilted. "The kind that might make you reconsider who the real criminal is in this situation." She left. The door closed, and the room became so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking like a warning. Something was waiting to explode. I called Victor immediately. "Victor, Mrs. Hollowell just came here and threatened me," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "She said they found something about Milton's business activities that could make me reconsider prosecuting." On the other end, Victor was silent for a moment. Then he said, slow and clear, "Althea, Whatever they think they have, it doesn't change the fact that Corinne and Bryce committed crimes. But could it affect the case? I asked. It's possible. If they muddy the waters enough, create doubt about Milton's character or business dealings, it could influence a jury. I tightened my grip on the phone, a heaviness settling in my chest. 43 years of marriage. How much did I truly know about Milton? I took a deep breath. Victor, I want to know everything about Milton's business, every transaction, every partner, every irregularity that might exist. Victor hesitated again. Althea, are you sure? Sometimes the past is better left alone. The Hollowells are threatening to drag Milton's memory through the mud to protect their criminal son, I replied without hesitation. I want the truth first. That night, I sat in Milton's study and began turning over files like someone stripping layers of paint off a family portrait. Milton had been obsessively meticulous, documents dated and labeled, neatly categorized, clipped into folders like a man who believed order could keep life from collapsing. But the deeper I dug into his business records, the more I found things that weren't right. Payments to shell companies, consulting fees far beyond what made sense, partnerships that existed only on paper. I felt like I was seeing cracks beneath the foundation, cracks that had always been there. I had just never bent down to look. Near midnight, I found the thing that made my hands go ice cold. A file hidden behind a false drawer inside Milton's filing cabinet. I pulled it out, my heart pounding. Inside were contracts with companies I had never heard of. Transfers to offshore accounts, and a series of handwritten notes in Milton's own handwriting, short like code. Torino, 500K, Springfield Ave. Castellano, 750K, Port Newark. DiMaggio, 1.2 M. Broad Street. Those names, I had heard them somewhere. Not at friends' parties, not on any list of business partners, but in whispers, stories people told about crime families in New Jersey. The locations were all in Newark and nearby, and the amounts were so large my chest went hollow. My hand trembled as I turned page after page. 43 years of marriage, and I had never known. I had never suspected. Milton, my husband, the man I trusted, the father of my child, what had he done? Fragments of memory rose in my mind, things that had always seemed normal. The nights he came home late, saying he had been meeting clients. The secret phone calls in his study with the door shut tight. The times he brought home large amounts of cash and told me it was a bonus from successful deals. And I, the good wife, didn't ask. Didn't dig. I believed a man's affairs were something women like me shouldn't touch. Then the phone rang. An unknown number. I answered. My heart suddenly squeezed tight. Mrs. Sterling? A man's voice, polite, with a trace of Jersey at the edges, as if he were trying to sound respectful. You may want to stop digging into your husband's past. There are people who don't want old secrets brought into the light. I shot to my feet. Who is this? I demanded. The voice stayed calm, as if reminding me to shut the window before the storm blew in. Consider this friendly advice. The Hollowell family isn't your only enemy. There are other people who care about what you might find in those files. Then the line went dead. I stood in the darkness of Milton's study, surrounded by evidence of a double life I had never known existed. And in that exact moment, I understood. Corinne and Bryce might only be the tip of the iceberg. Milton hadn't left me only an inheritance. He had left me a ticking bomb, and the clock was ticking. The private investigator Victor introduced me to arrived the next afternoon. She was a woman with eyes so sharp, I felt like I'd been scanned by an X-ray from the very first second. Her name was Raven Dillard. She specialized in financial crimes. Raven didn't waste time. She walked straight into Milton's study, opened her bag, put on gloves, and started working like someone defusing a bomb. Careful, fast, and missing nothing. For 6 hours, she photographed every page of documents, cross-checked dates, and wrote notes at the speed of someone who had seen far too many dirty tricks in her life. When night fell, Raven looked up at me, her expression professional and faintly compassionate. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, "your husband was running a sophisticated money laundering operation through his consulting company. We're talking about millions of dollars in illegal transactions over the past decade." Even though I had prepared myself, had seen the evidence with my own eyes, hearing those words spoken out loud still felt like a punch straight to my stomach. "That's impossible," I blurted, my voice going thin. "Milton is the most honest man I've ever known." Raven didn't argue. She simply pulled a chair over and spread the documents across Milton's desk, like laying puzzle pieces out on an operating table. "I'm very sorry, but the evidence is overwhelming." She pointed to each page. Invoices for services that were never performed. Consulting contracts with companies that don't exist. Payment schedules that match recorded criminal activity. I stared at the pile of papers, seeing company names I'd never heard, seeing signatures I recognized, and seeing a life I had never truly lived alongside. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, almost whispering. "Based on the records, at least 12 years, possibly longer." 12 years. While I planned dinner menus, arranged flowers for charity galas, and tried to be the proper wife, Milton had been doing something else entirely behind the closed door of his study. Raven looked at me, then lowered her voice. "Mrs. Sterling, there's one more thing." Her tone turned more severe. "The $10 million Milton left to Corinne, that money came directly from laundered funds. If the FBI finds out, they could seize everything as proceeds of criminal activity." The room seemed to tilt. "Everything?" I asked, my throat burning dry. "Everything," Raven said. Then she hesitated, as if weighing how cruel the next sentence would sound. "Unless," she met my eyes, "unless Corinne and Bryce's legal team already knows and plans to use it as leverage." Cold wash through me. "What do you mean?" "If they proactively disclose your husband's crimes to the FBI, they may be able to negotiate immunity in exchange for cooperation. So Corinne and Bryce weren't just thieves. They were holding a nuclear weapon over my head." "What options do I have?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice from shaking. Raven answered plainly. "No threats, just truth delivered like a verdict. Legally, you can contact the FBI yourself, come forward voluntarily, and hope for leniency. You'll lose most of the money, but you may be able to keep the house." "And if I don't?" I asked. "Corinne and Bryce's attorneys will probably leak it strategically. You'll still lose everything, and you could also face charges for unknowingly benefiting from criminal activity." I suddenly remembered Lenora Hollowell's confident eyes, her certainty when she bargained $2 million, then $5 million. It hadn't only been arrogance. They knew. They had known all along. Right then, my phone rang. Corinne's name appeared on the screen like black ink spreading across white paper. I picked up. "Mom, we need to meet tonight." "There are things you need to know about Dad. It'll change everything." I closed my eyes, exhaustion rising like a wave. "I already know, Corinne," I said slowly. "I know about the money laundering. I know about the criminal connections. I know that everything Dad left us is contaminated." On the other end, silence. One beat. Then Corinne's voice returned, tighter, faster. "Listen to me carefully. Bryce's attorney has contacted the FBI. They're willing to let us renegotiate the situation." "Renegotiate how?" I asked. "Bryce gets immunity in exchange for providing information about Dad's criminal network. You get to keep $5 million and the house. The rest goes to the government." I heard every word clearly, and something in my chest went cold. "And you?" I asked. "The fraud charges disappear. All of us walk away from this mess." Brilliant. In the most twisted, chilling way, Corinne had turned my moral victory into her strategic advantage. "Corinne, you're asking me to help you profit from your crimes by exploiting Dad's crimes," I said. Corinne's voice sharpened, but she still tried to sound reasonable. "I'm asking you to be practical. The alternative is losing everything and possibly facing charges yourself. I looked around Milton's study, seeing it clearly for the first time. Expensive wood, rare books, framed art, and if Corinne was right, then all of it had been bought with blood money. I need time to think, I said. Mom, the FBI meeting is tomorrow morning. Bryce's attorney needs an answer tonight. I hung up. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the dark of Milton's study, listening to the clock run and feeling the cold of the large house. There's a very strange moment when you realize you're standing between two choices that can both destroy you. One side is silence, trying to hold on to what remains, hoping no one finds out. The other side is truth, bare and exposed, and the price could be everything you just fought to reclaim. I thought about 43 years of marriage to a man who now suddenly felt like a stranger. I thought about Corinne, my daughter, who hadn't only inherited money from her father, but also inherited his ability to deceive. But then I realized Corinne had made one fatal mistake. She always assumed that when I was cornered, I would collapse. She had never seen me truly fight. I picked up the phone and called Raven Dillard. Raven, how quickly can I meet with the FBI? I asked. On the other end, Raven didn't ask why. She just answered short and direct, like she'd predicted this step. Do you want to meet tonight or early morning? I stared at my faint reflection in the study window. As soon as possible, I said. I have a story to tell them, and I think they'll find it very interesting. FBI agent Quincy Boyd appeared in Victor's conference room exactly like the template of a federal investigator. Serious, intelligent, and completely immune to anything that could be called pleading. He sat across from me, turned on a recorder, and took notes with mechanical precision. Mrs. Sterling, you understand that by coming forward voluntarily, you may be admitting you benefited from criminal income? I understand, I said. But I'd rather tell the truth than let my daughter and son-in-law manipulate this situation to benefit themselves. And I told him. I told him about Milton's hidden business operation. I told him about Corinne's fraud scheme. I told him about Bryce's forged documents. And about the attempted extortion disguised under the name settlement offer. Agent Boyd listened without interrupting. His eyes didn't miss a detail. When I finished, he set his pen down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Mrs. Sterling, your daughter believes she can trade information about your husband's crimes in exchange for immunity for her own crimes? Yes, I said. And for the first time, Agent Boyd smiled. Mrs. Sterling, I have news for you. Your husband was not only laundering money for the Torino family, he was an FBI informant. My world tipped completely to one side. What? I breathed. Deep undercover operation, long-term investigation. For 12 years, he provided information on them, while outwardly maintaining the cover that he was facilitating laundering. So Milton was a hero, not a criminal? I shook my head as if shaking hard enough would knock the truth back out of my ears. But the money was real, I said. It was, Agent Boyd nodded. The FBI permitted him to retain a percentage of the laundered funds as payment for his cooperation and to maintain his cover. Everything he left to you was created through lawful federal cooperation. I stared at him, trying to swallow that information like a pill too large to get down. 43 years, and I had never known how my husband lived. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked. Because the investigation was ongoing, and because we weren't sure whether you were involved or knew anything, Agent Boyd said bluntly. Your daughter and son-in-law's fraud scheme actually helped us confirm your innocence. He opened a thick file, flipping to pages stamped in red, filled with numbers and dense notes. For 12 years, Milton provided information that led to 47 arrests and the seizure of more than $200 million in criminal assets, Agent Boyd said. He died before the investigation concluded, but his cooperation was invaluable. Tears rose before I could wipe them away. Milton, the man I had only just begun to resent for his secrets, had been carrying a secret entirely different. Corinne and Bryce, they didn't know this, did they? I asked. They suspected criminal activity, but they had no idea about federal cooperation, Agent Boyd replied. They plan to blackmail you with something that actually clears your husband. The irony was almost poetic. Corinne tried to steal my inheritance twice, once through fraud and once through extortion, based on incomplete information. So what happens now? I asked. Now you get your money back. Your daughter and son-in-law face federal charges. And you decide what kind of life you want to build with that lawful inheritance. I swallowed hard. And the danger Bryce mentioned, the Torino family? Agent Boyd gave a cold smile. The Torino family will be busy with their own legal trouble. We're executing search warrants across 3 states tomorrow morning. I looked around Victor's conference room. The place that had once been the beginning of my humiliation now felt like the place I was being reborn. Agent Boyd gathered his file. Victor smiled, his eyes full of approval. Raven nodded at me, one nod of respect. I asked suddenly, as if testing whether my heart still had any kindness left in it. Agent Boyd, can I ask you something? Of course. In your professional experience, am I a bad person for feeling satisfied that Corinne was arrested? Agent Boyd laughed. This time, a real laugh, warmer. Mrs. Sterling, in my professional opinion, you are a woman who refused to become a victim. That isn't bad. That's inspiring. When they left, I stood by the conference room window and looked down at Military Park. People were still walking, still talking, still living ordinary days. Life kept moving. But my life had changed direction. Milton wasn't perfect. He kept secrets. He lived a dangerous life I had never known. But in the end, he protected me. Not only with money, but with dignity. I thought about Corinne, probably sitting with her lawyer right now, still believing she was about to negotiate her way out. Still believing I was too weak, too afraid, too wounded to fight to the end. I picked up my phone and sent her one final message. My dear daughter, I just walked out of the FBI office. Turns out Dad wasn't a criminal, he was a hero. And you, sweetheart, just lost your final chance to do the right thing. See you in court. I turned off the screen. Then I looked out at the city below, Newark, the city Milton had protected, and the city where I would now learn how to live as a free woman. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in 43 years, I was fighting for myself, and I was winning. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of the newly renovated house making coffee for 2. Morning sunlight poured through the new windows, frames that now actually opened properly, no longer jammed stiff the way they used to be. It lit up the kitchen countertop I had chosen with my own hands, for the first time in 43 years. I still wasn't used to that feeling, the feeling of choosing what I liked without glancing at anyone, without asking anyone's opinion, without fearing I'd be judged as wasteful. Good morning, Althea. Raven Dillard appeared in the doorway, holding a thick stack of files. Now, she wasn't just the private investigator from that case. She was also my financial advisor. Good morning, Raven. I set 2 mugs down. Ready for our quarterly review? The past 6 months had been like a whirlwind. Legal procedures, media interviews, one call after another, and a quiet but violent transformation inside me, the kind no camera could ever fully capture. Corinne and Bryce had each been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. News of their crimes spread so fast I could barely breathe, and strangely, it turned me into a kind of celebrity in elder protection circles. People messaged me, called me a symbol. Some even called me the revenge mother. But they didn't know. About the nights I sat still staring at the wall, asking myself how a child I gave birth to could ever say, "Go find somewhere else to die." Raven sat down at my new breakfast table and flipped open the files like someone checking the pulse of the future. Your investment portfolio is performing excellently, Raven said. The charity fund is fully operational, and the scholarship fund has selected its first recipients. I nodded as if it were normal. even though it still felt strange to hear the words investment portfolio attached to me. The Althea Sterling Elder Protection Fund had become my main focus. I used $15 million from the inheritance to fund legal support for elderly people being financially abused inside their own families, and to push legislative changes that strengthened protections for seniors. Not to prove I was good at it, but to prove they weren't alone. "And the documentary?" Raven asked, keeping her tone as casual as if she were asking about a routine expense. "Netflix confirmed the production deal," I replied. "They want to start filming next month." My story had traveled beyond the initial news cycle. A Mother's Revenge, an American crime story, was being developed as a limited series, and the proceeds would go to organizations supporting seniors. Raven studied me more closely, then lowered her voice, careful. "And Corinne?" she asked. "She wrote again?" Corinne had sent me 19 letters from federal prison. I read the first few. They swung from self-justification to desperation, from apology to disguised blame. Then I stopped opening them. "Her lawyer says she wants to apologize and ask for forgiveness," I said. I looked out the window toward the back garden, where I had planted new rose bushes. Not the rose variety I once planted for Milton. These flowers were mine. I cared for them my way. No one stood behind me offering comments on what I should plant, what I should cut, what I should keep. "Raven," I said, my voice calm, "schedule an appointment with Corinne's lawyer." Raven looked up. "To reconcile?" "No," I answered immediately. "Not to reconcile. To make one thing clear." "What?" she asked. "I want Corinne to understand that her actions have consequences beyond a sentence. I want her to know she destroyed our relationship permanently, and the kids will grow up knowing why their mother went to prison." Raven wrote it down in her leather folder. "That sounds harsh." "Good," I said. "It's allowed to be harsh. Corinne made an adult choice and hurt the person she was supposed to love. She doesn't get to escape emotional consequences just because she wrote a few letters in prison." Raven closed the file. "And the kids? Corinne requested supervised visitation with them." This was the hardest part. Lily, 9, and Marcus, 7, were innocent victims in all of this. "I won't turn them into tools for Corinne's recovery process," I said, slowly but clearly. "My relationship with them will be based on their own choices when they're grown, not on their mother's attempt to redeem herself." "They're living with Bryce's parents now," Raven said. "I know," I exhaled. "When they're old enough to understand, they'll decide for themselves whether they want a relationship with me." Just then, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered with the caution that had become instinct. "Mrs. Sterling, this is Janet Cooper from Channel 7 News. We're doing a follow-up Where Are They Now segment on high-profile elder abuse cases. Would you be interested in participating?" I looked at Raven. She nodded encouragement. "Send me the details," I said into the phone. "But I have one condition. We focus on educating viewers about warning signs, not just exploiting drama. If I tell my story, it has to help other people." When Raven left, the house grew quiet again. I went upstairs into what used to be Milton's study. It wasn't a study anymore. I had turned it into an art room, a bright open space where I was finding something I had lost, the joy of creating beauty simply because I wanted to. On the easel was an unfinished self-portrait, a woman standing in sunlight, her face turned forward. That woman didn't look like the grieving widow who once stuffed her whole life into 2 suitcases and a box of photos. The woman in the painting looked stronger, more independent. And most importantly, no longer afraid. She looked like someone who had learned that the best revenge isn't retaliation. It's becoming the version of yourself your enemies never believed you could become. I dipped the brush into paint. Brilliant gold, bold orange, deep purple, colors the obedient wife of my past would never have dared to use, colors of rebirth, colors of freedom. Outside the window, Newark stretched under the light. In the distance, I could see Branch Brook Park, where in the spring I planned to offer free painting classes for older women. I wanted them to have a place to breathe, a place to talk, a place to paint themselves back into existence. My phone buzzed. A message from Victor Langley. The final sentencing has been issued. Corinne at 18 months. Bryce, 24 months plus restitution. Justice has been served. I read it twice, waiting for the feeling of victory, waiting for satisfaction, waiting for a wave of serves you right. But what came over me was something quieter. Not happiness. Not yet. Not exactly forgiveness, maybe never, but acceptance. Acceptance that some relationships, once broken, aren't just hard to repair. They shouldn't be repaired. I texted back, "Thank you, Victor. Now the next part begins." I returned to the easel and added the final strokes to the woman's face in the painting. Her eyes, my eyes, looked straight ahead with a clarity I had never had in 43 years of being a wife. The painting told a story of a woman who lost everything and discovered she was stronger than she imagined. Of a mother who learned that love doesn't mean allowing abuse. Of a widow who discovered her husband was a hero. But more importantly, she could be one too. The sun rose over Newark. New light for a new day, for a new life. I set the brush down and looked at the finished painting. It wasn't a masterpiece, not museum art, but it was mine. Every stroke, every color, every choice, just like my life now. And if Corinne wanted to rebuild a relationship with this woman, she would need to bring more than a few prison letters and an empty apology. She would need to bring a complete transformation worthy of what I had lived through. Because I spent 67 years living on other people's terms. For the rest of my life, I will live on my own. And the first term? No one gets to take my value away from me ever again. I learned how to fight, and I won. If you want to hear stories like this, where justice arrives late but is never absent, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story.